Honourable members, please be seated.
Introduction of visitors. Introduction of guests.
Honourable members, prior to the introduction of guests today, I want to bring to your attention, you'll find green sheets showing some amendments made to the standing orders by Government Motion 6 that took place this morning in the Assembly. Replacement pages for your standing orders, which I'm sure is all of your favorite reading, are being prepared and will be distributed in the coming weeks. Honourable members, guests visiting us today, we have a number of school groups, 3 of them to be exact. Please rise as I call your school. From the constituency of Edmonton McClung, please welcome grade 6 students from Lumbing Elementary. From Edmonton Glenora, grade 6 students from Edmonton Christian West, and from Edmonton Rutherford Stannis School, what the member from Edmonton Rutherford said. Please welcome. Please welcome the students. Honourable members, I also have a very, very special introduction, and before we proceed to that, I would like to officially congratulate Chris Cahill as our new Sergeant at Arms for the Legislative Assembly. His exceptional leadership skills, security expertise, and background with the LAO, I know that I'm speaking for everyone. We are very excited to have you in the permanent role as the Sergeant at Arms, and I might add, the 9th Sergeant at Arms in the province of Alberta. Welcome. But perhaps more importantly than that is Chris's family is joining us here today. And I encourage you to rise as I call each and every one of you. His daughter Michelle Cahill and her partner Kelly Hagstrom, daughter Trisha, her husband Devin, and their daughters Ruth and Abigail, daughter Christine and her husband Tyler and their kids Jake and Maya, daughter Alyssa, her husband Kevin and their son Troy, and Chris's son Robert Cahill. It's an absolute pleasure to have you all joining us here today. We hope you enjoy seeing your dad and granddad in his finest form. Welcome to the Assembly. Also in the Speaker's Gallery this afternoon are very special guests of the member for Highwood. He paid me to say that because it's his wife, Leanne Sigurdsson, and their good friend, Angie Clark, and also visiting today, guest of the Minister of Service Alberta, Brenda Neville. Welcome all to the Assembly.
Ministerial statements.
The Honourable, the Minister of Culture, Multiculturalism and the Status of Women.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in the Legislative Assembly at the first available opportunity to express our sorrow and solidarity for those families that face the tragedy of Flight PS 752. Albertans learned of the news of Ukraine International Airlines Flight PS 752 with shock and heartbreak. As soon as we heard of the tragedy, so too did we hear of the tremendous loss to our own Alberta family. We remain united in our grief for those who tragically lost their lives, and as a province, as a community, we are here for all of those who must live with this profound heartbreak as they piece together a new normal in their lives. Those families that were shattered in an instant in this unexplainable act of violence remain in our hearts and our minds as we reflect on the magnitude of their loss. So many innocents with so much more to contribute to our country now gone, leaving inconsolable pain in the hearts of their loved ones and a deep well of sadness and loss shared by all who knew them. Their personal stories collectively speak of the best and brightest in our community, dedicated educators, successful professionals, gifted students, and loving couples, parents, and children. Many who live here in Alberta often refer to it as a small town because of the interconnectedness of its communities. Many of the Albertans that were lost were part of a really tight-knit community that exists within the heart of our large cities, with more than 1 million people across our province, 4 times that size. For Albertans' Persian community, the tragic impact of this disaster cannot be overstated. The togetherness of their community helped new families establish roots here and provided support for the less fortunate, taught, loved, and lived here. Indeed, part of the heartbreak comes from the shared purpose that so many had being on that doomed flight, returning from a wedding and celebrating that togetherness for which they are known. There are more than 14,000 Canadians of Iranian descent living in Alberta today. It is startling how many can cite a direct or indirect connection to the victims. This devastating incident had a profound impact on the whole of our province, but especially here in Edmonton, our capital city. A disproportionate number of those who lost their lives called this city home. And now this city bears that disproportionate loss. It is all the more tragic that the Iranian Canadian victims aboard flight PS 752, having known peace and security of living here, were claimed by violence during a visit to their homeland. Incidents like this remind us how precious and how fragile our peaceful and pluralistic society is, and how unbelievably lucky we all are to call it home. As we grieve for the enormous losses to our community, we should take solace at what we have achieved in Alberta, our diversity, our civility, and compassion for each other, and celebrate what we have built together as Canadians. We should resolve to remember that the people that we lost as exemplars of these Canadian virtues, and to tell the world of the irreplaceable loss that stems from another act of senseless violence. On behalf of the government and the people of Alberta, I wish to express condolences and to pay homage to the victims of Flight PS 752 and the families and friends. The road ahead of us is not easy. The journey through this grief is unimaginable to bear alone, but please understand this. For all those living in the shadow of this catastrophe, you are not walking this road alone. An entire province stands with you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and God rest their innocent souls.
Hear, hear.
The honourable member for Edmonton Riverview to respond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to honour and remember the victims of a terrible tragedy. On January 8th, 63 Canadians were killed when Flight PS 752 was shot down shortly after takeoff in Iran. The investigation into the crash is ongoing, and I hope investigators get the answers that can provide at least some closure to the families of those who perished in the crash. Alberta's Iranian Canadian community suffered a devastating loss, and it has touched all of us. The lives taken belong to our families, our neighbours, and our friends. The sudden loss of these members of our community has left a trail of heartbroken family members, classmates, and colleagues. My constituency of Edmonton Riverview is home to the University of Alberta, who lost 10 members of their campus community. Thousands of Albertans came together at the university to remember the victims and to extend their support to those grieving. I was honoured and grateful to be among them. This past Saturday, a memorial was held at Edmonton City Hall, organized by the Iranian Heritage Society of Edmonton. The memorial paid tribute to the members of our community who perished in the crash. I'm proud of Albertans who united to mourn and to support each other in the days and weeks after the crash. But the impact of this tragedy will be felt in our country for many years to come. This year, Western Canadian High School in Calgary will be a graduate short. The University of Alberta is mourning scholars, classmates, and leaders whose careers and contributions have been tragically cut short. Across the province, many families are grieving children whose laughter no longer brightens our days. And next month, as Iranian Canadians prepare to celebrate Nowruz, many will mourn again for those who cannot join them for the coming new year. On behalf of our caucus, I extend our heartfelt condolences to the families of the victims. You are not alone. Albertans are here for you, and we will continue to support you.
Member statements.
The honourable member for Calgary Falconridge has a statement to make.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe all the members in this House have worked hard, demonstrated exemplary leadership skills, a passion for public service, and helping people. For some of us, it might have been a lifelong dream. Most of us spend countless hours outdoors, on phones, and at events in order to take our place inside this chamber. Becoming an elected member is no small feat, and even if we disagree with other views, we should expect all to be treated with the basic amount of respect, dignity, especially by other MLAs. This is why I was shocked when I heard the member from Calgary-McCall insult the intelligence and importance of private members on a radio talk show recently. No one here became an MLA to sabotage our province. We all have Albertans' best interest in mind, even if we take different paths to achieve these goals. Everyone in this House plays an important role, and downplaying the contributions and efforts of other MLAs is a behavior you would expect on an elementary school playground, not in the most important building of this province. Private members pass along constituency-specific viewpoints and resolve issues that only local representatives might know about. They also vote on bills, motions, and debates, issues in a way that represent their specific riding views. Without private members, a party could not hold government, and democracy would not exist. Regardless of our political views or party loyalty or personal opinions, elected members are expected to set the bar for professional conduct, not lower themselves into the mud of ignorant comments as the member of Calgary-McCall did. I would urge the member to keep in mind why we are here to serve the best interest of constituents with respect, dignity, and honor. Thank you.
Hear, hear.
The honourable member for Edmonton Northwest.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we stand in this chamber on Pink Shirt Day, I'm reminded of the need to not only address bullying and the toll that it takes on everyone who experiences it, but also to make sure that we have supports in place for those who are struggling. Quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, I'm very concerned about supports for Alberta's post-secondary students. Over these past few months, I've been meeting with students and leaders across this province to talk about what they've been experiencing. Mr. Speaker, students are stressed. Students are worried. Students are struggling. They're dealing with massive tuition increases, increased interest on student loans, operational and capital cuts to their institutions, cancellation of the STEP program, uncertainty around scholarships and bursaries, and fears around the impact of performance-based funding, and much, much more. Overarching all of this, again and again, I heard these stresses and fears affecting mental health on campus. During our time in government, we knew that providing actual funding and supports for campus mental health is critical. We allocated $25.8 million for 3 years in a framework that would be expiring this month. To this date, this government has not committed to the stability of ongoing supports for students. With the unprecedented costs and stresses being downloaded onto students' shoulders to pay a $4.7 billion corporate giveaway, and taking away their certainty and security of being able to access essential mental health supports and the tools they need to cope with that stress, I believe is deplorable. Post-secondary education is the single greatest tool that we have to create the leaders of tomorrow and to ensure the success of our province. But if we continue to put up barriers to entrance, accessibility, affordability, and the supports that students need on campuses, we are compromising everyone's future in this process.
The Honourable, the member for Grand Prairie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in the House today sporting a pink shirt to highlight the issue of bullying. Bullying continues to be a problem in our world today, in classrooms and workplaces, and unfortunately, it can even follow us home through online bullying. Celebrated around the world, Pink Shirt Day began in 2007 when two students, David Shepard and Travis Price, took a stand against bullying after a young grade 9 boy was harassed and threatened for wearing a pink shirt on the first day of school. The next day, David and Travis distributed pink shirts to boys in their school and sent the clear message to the bullied student that he was not alone. This act of kindness started a movement that is now known as Pink Shirt Day, and these young students helped inspire others to stand up to bullying. Pink Shirt Day continues to grow every single year, with participants working together to raise awareness and eliminate bullying from their communities. We know it is important to foster strong and healthy relationships within our society. Pink Shirt Day is one opportunity to publicly stand for community kindness and support. Together, through this simple act, we celebrate diversity and promote positive social relationships and inclusion. I am honored to rise today, Mr. Speaker, in my pink shirt, along with many other members in this House, to stand in support of this movement and to encourage Albertans to join us against bullying today and every day. I encourage you all to spread this message about bullying prevention. Getting involved is easy. Wear your pink shirt and share it on social media with the Pink Shirt Day and Where to Turn hashtags to raise further awareness. The theme for this year's Pink Shirt Day is Lift Each Other Up, a simple but powerful message encouraging us to look beyond our differences and celebrate the things that make us unique. When we lift each other up, we see past the things that separate us and see instead the things that unite us as people. I think we could start that in this House, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I read a letter from a group of Albertans who have been impacted by addiction. We lost our son, brother, and partner a little over 4 years ago to fentanyl overdose. Nathan was a guy with a formidable intelligence, good looks, a loving family, and an amazing partner. Yet none of these things mattered when it came to addiction. We watched with a feeling of helplessness as he struggled with his addiction and sank further away into a world that we couldn't reach. Over the year and a half before Nathan died, we came to realize that the available community supports were neither sufficient nor appropriate for dealing with opiate addiction. Nathan's 6-week stint in rehab facility was ineffective and too short. The stigma he felt was huge, particularly when he overdosed just a couple of weeks after getting out of rehab. His embarrassment was palpable and heart-wrenching. After Nathan's death, we decided to start Change the Face of Addiction, an organization that advocates for evidence-based policy change. We felt strongly that something needed to be done to change the system. If there was anything we could do to prevent more deaths, to ensure that other families didn't have to go through what we and so many other families have gone through with the death of their loved ones, we wanted to do that work. We were so pleased to have supervised consumption sites approved in Alberta. They are an important link in a larger system of care and have certainly saved many, many lives. They've also provided important links to other services so that those suffering can access addiction counseling, mental health workers, adequate housing, and of course, rehabilitation centers. One of the things we realized about Nathan's journey into a downward spiral is that he was losing his community connection. Community is so important for all of us, and even more so for someone dealing with substance use issues. As Joe and Harry says in his seminal book, Chasing the Scream, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it is human connection. We are here to advocate for better policies for those impacted by substance use disorders. We are here to advocate for evidence-based treatment, for community connection. We are here to advocate for even more supervised consumption sites in Alberta.
Honourable members, we are at oral question period, and the Leader of Her Majesty's Official Opposition has the call.
Yes, she does.
A blueprint for jobs. The throne speech certainly contained the word jobs, Mr. Speaker, but not surprisingly, it didn't include one single program to create them. It was less of a blueprint and more like those flyers selling timeshares in Florida swampland. The truth is, Alberta has lost 50,000 full-time jobs since this Premier's $4.7 billion corporate handout. These are Albertans who are struggling to make ends meet. Why won't the Premier admit his plan is failing them?
The Honourable, the Premier.
First, Mr. Speaker, I welcome all members back to the spring session, and I invite all members to be focused on job number one, which is getting this province back to work. Mr. Speaker, Albertans understand that far too many are out of work after the 4-year-long NDP jobs crisis, and we're doing everything we can to restore growth. That's why banks and think tanks, economists all project Alberta will lead Canada in growth this year. The petroleum producers have said that as a result of our job creation tax cut, there will be billions of new investment. CNRL is spending $250 million on new wells. But, Mr. Speaker, raising taxes on everything, which is what the NDP wants to do, would kill jobs.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier says he's obsessed with job creation, but I really think he should go get a new hobby because he's really bad at that one. 19,000 jobs gone last month alone, and this year Canada's big banks are projecting 17,000 fewer jobs than this Premier promised just 4 months ago. And that's the best case scenario, Mr. Speaker. After the election, the Premier claimed his very presence would bring back jobs. Mr. Speaker, didn't he really mean to say that his very presence would drive them away?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I look forward to tomorrow's budget and the forthcoming blueprint for jobs, which will focus on our vigorous efforts to restore the investor confidence that was so deeply impaired by the NDP. But, Mr. Speaker, we should all grant that we continue to live through a time of economic adversity. What is the NDP's response? They actually are insisting that we raise taxes on job creators. They want us to raise income taxes. That was in their so-called shadow budget. And, Mr. Speaker, even after we won in defeating the federal carbon tax, they want us to reimpose an Alberta carbon tax.
The Leader of the Official Opposition.
Sooner or later, this Premier is going to run out of other people to blame. But let's be clear, he promised 215,000 jobs in the next 4 years, but so far he's lost 50,000 in 6 months. That puts him at a full 265,000 jobs off target with no plan in sight. Meanwhile, investor tax credits, gone. Digital media support's gone. Right. Partial upgrading, gone. Mr. Speaker, when will this job-killing Premier start doing his job? Albertans are desperate to know.
The Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I know that the Socialists on the other side of the House want to cheer on the enemies of this province that have been trying to landlock us. They even want to bring Extinction Rebellion into our classrooms, Mr. Speaker. We just won an historic victory on the job-killing carbon tax. And what does the NDP want us to do? To impose an Alberta carbon tax. Mr. Speaker, could the Leader of the Opposition tell us, during a time of economic fragility, when too many people are out of work, how would we create jobs? By raising taxes on job creators. That's the NDP policy.
The Leader of the Official Opposition.
Blaming everyone else. Mr. Speaker, you know, it was bad news for Alberta jobs when Tech withdrew its application, but contrary to this Premier's wild claims, their reasons are in writing. Investors need, quote, jurisdictions to have a framework in place that reconciles resource development and climate change. This does not yet exist here. Why won't this Premier admit his overheated hostility to environmental science, his lack of real action on climate change, and his irresponsible rhetoric, like we just heard, cost Albertans over 7,000 jobs? Hear, hear.
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I am so proud of the work of this government to ensure full Indigenous support for the tech frontier mine. This is something the NDP did nothing about. Thanks to the work of the Minister of Indigenous Relations, Minister of the Environment, we had unqualified agreements from the local First Nations to support that project, which the NDP has cheered against. You know, they support Extinction Rebellion. They have MLAs out there at rallies sponsored by Extinction Rebellion to oppose the tech mine in every project while we moved heaven and earth to get that done, Mr. Speaker.
The Leader of of the official opposition. This is the first supplemental of your second question.
Well, Mr. Speaker, none of the things that Premier just said are true. And it's not just tech, however, making the case that I just outlined from reading a letter that was in black and white. The Calgary Chamber says, quote, we can and we must be able to lead in natural resource development and solve climate change through innovation. We need real decisive action on climate change with tangible outcomes and conviction. Mr. Speaker, everyone but this Premier can see that his fake it till you make it climate plan is failing Albertans and leave them behind. Why can't he?
Fake it. Fake it.
Point of order noted. Is that what you were asking for? Got it. The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, this government imposed, to keep our platform commitment, the Technology Innovation and Emissions Reduction Program that will help to reduce CO2 emissions from Alberta by an estimated 57 megatons. This government has been trying to get an equivalency agreement with the Government of Canada on methane regulations that would be even more rigorous than their regulations, but at lower cost to our economy. This government has demonstrated its willingness to work with Indigenous people and the Government of Canada on habitat protection for caribou and for bison. Mr. Speaker, this government is showing real action on these issues. All the NDP wants to do is to tax.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, you know, the Calgary Chamber of Commerce also said, quote, the rhetoric by political leaders, i.e. this Premier, is severely hindering any future progress, and, quote, more anger and louder voices are not in the best interests of our citizens. And how did this UCP respond, Mr. Speaker? Their executive director accused the Chamber, quote, stroking their own vanity with downtown elites. Mr. Speaker, when will this government realize that attacking everyone that disagrees with them is not a job creation strategy, and in many cases loses jobs, 7,000.
The Honourable, the Premier has the call.
Mr. Speaker, Tech was very clear, both publicly and to me privately, that the environment of rail blockages in Canada has created a situation that is unfriendly to any investment in this country. You know who's blocking those rails? In part, a group called Extinction Rebellion, which has been endorsed by the NDP as a group that should be presenting to children in Alberta classrooms, Mr. Speaker. This is a group who sponsored a rally attended by half the NDP caucus, the same group that's blocking railways and roadways in this country. Mr. Speaker, they'll face tough times.
The Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, if it wasn't bad enough that this Premier is firing thousands of registered nurses, he's now attacking family doctors just to pay for his $4.7 billion no-jobs corporate handout. The AMA says the Premier is putting patients at risk. But instead of negotiating, he's daring doctors to leave. Well, newsflash, Mr. Speaker, they are. Family doctors in Canmore are already packing up, leaving thousands of people with no doctor. To this Premier, he promised Albertans he would not attack frontline services. Why is he breaking this promise?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I see the campaign of division and deception just carries on. The NDP will not be bothered by the facts. There's no $4.5 billion giveaway, subsidy, tax cut. It's in this year's fiscal plan, the job creation tax cut represents $200 million in foregone revenue, as multiple independent economists have confirmed. With respect to physicians, Mr. Speaker, last year, physician compensation was $5.4 billion. Under what we are proposing next year, physician compensation will be $5.4 billion, Mr. Speaker, the highest level in Canada and the highest level in our history.
Hear, hear. The Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this Premier is costing families their actual doctor. The only one in town in some places. And you know what happens when people don't have a doctor? They get sicker, they end up in hospitals, and costs go even higher. The Premier's not saving money, he's dismantling our healthcare system. Mr. Speaker, why won't this Premier stop the attack on Albertans' healthcare?
The Honourable, the Premier has the call.
Why won't the opposition leaders stop scaring people irresponsibly, Mr. Speaker? This government is spending more on health care than the NDP did. This government is spending more on health care than any Alberta government in history has. This government is spending more per capita on health care than any province in Canada. This government is compensating physicians at record levels. This government is compensating physicians at, in some cases, $100,000 a year more than comparable physicians in other provinces. Mr. Speaker, within that budget, we must control our expenses, and we ask our physicians to be partners in that. Hear, hear.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, here's what doctors have to say. Dr. Vishil Varshney says this Premier is putting these patients at huge risk. Dr. Marcia Kuchera says this will put strain and increased costs on our system. Dr. Jill Conkin says we can't afford to lose our next generation of rural physicians. Dr. Donovan Nunweiler says it will result in worse outcomes for patients. Dr. Fiona Mattel says the repercussions will last a generation. To the Premier, who should Albertans trust? Him with his record of constant misinformation or their family? Doctor, don't bother, don't answer. We know the answer.
Order. The Premier has the call.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, there you just saw the performance that landed that leader as the first Premier in history to be fired by Alberta voters, Mr. Speaker. The incivility, the deception, and the division, Mr. Speaker. You know what people should trust? The numbers. The numbers tell the story. $22 billion in expenditures on...
Order. I heard the question very clearly. I have the opportunity to hear the answer as well. The Premier is the one with the call.
They can't even get through their first question period without shouting and trying to bring this disorder to this place because they respect Albertans so little. We, however, Mr. Speaker, are prioritizing health spending. $22 billion this year, a record high. Physician compensation, $5.4 billion, a record high. If that's bad, then why do the NDP spend less on these things, Mr. Speaker?
A point of order is noted at 2:01 by the Opposition House Leader. And now, the member for Lethbridge West has the call.
Well, thank you, Albertans. Mr. Speaker, we're pretty startled to hear the Premier's plan for a new state-owned oil company in the throne speech. No one was more startled, as it turns out, than the member for Cypress Medicine Hat. The former finance and energy critic went on a social media spree last night, arguing that Lockheed-era projects touted by the Premier cost Albertans billions of dollars. So, who should the people of Medicine Hat listen to about state-owned oil companies, Mr. Speaker? Their UCP MLA or the UCP Premier?
The Honourable, the Minister of Finance and the President of Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, this government will defend Alberta's energy industry. This government will defend the high-value asset that Albertans own today. We recognize that the energy industry has great challenge out there in today's environment, partly, Mr. Speaker, because of misinformation that has been circulating. Alberta has the most environmentally responsible energy industry in the world, and this government will support it.
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Member for Lethbridge West.
Well, Mr. Speaker, a note for the Finance Minister. The call is coming from inside the House. This Premier's so-called jobs plan has actually lost 50,000 full-time jobs. And this Premier's economic plan has led all the big banks to downgrade their forecasts for Alberta. And this Premier has come home empty-handed from every single one of his international junkets to seek investment. Isn't the member for Cypress Medicine Hat quite right to be skeptical of the Premier's belief that he can outsmart global capital markets?
The Honourable, the President of Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, we remain confident in our plan to improve the business environment in this province and turn the tide on investment that the members opposite chased out of the province, and with it, tens of thousands of jobs. Mr. Speaker, we remain confident that our plan will return investment, and with it, jobs and activity. This will take some time. We remain committed to it. We're confident that we are on solid ground.
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Member for Lethbridge West.
Well, thank thank you, Mr. Speaker. This Premier has apparently ruled out any involvement in his new state-owned oil company from the investment professionals at AIMCO, and I'm quite relieved he won't be meddling in AIMCO, and I imagine AIMCO's pretty relieved too. But his government does already have a record of no-bid contracts for the Premier's friends inside less than a year. So shouldn't the member for Cypress Medicine Hat also be worried that this announcement will be a way to funnel his constituents' tax dollars into pet projects of the Premier's friends?
That's right. The Honourable, the Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I know without a doubt that the people of Cypress Hills Medicine Hat, what they do not like, Mr. Speaker, was the NDP government who brought in the largest deficit in the history of the province, who brought in the largest job loss in the history of the province, Mr. Speaker, who messed with our electoral system at every chance they got, Mr. Speaker. And what the good people of Cypress Hills Medicine Hat said loud and clear when they sent their honourable member to this House was to come here, defend the system, defend our province, get this province back on track, Mr. Speaker. And I can assure you, through you to them, we will get this province back on track. We will balance the budget, and we will reject all of the NDP policies.
Honourable members, order. The Honourable Member for Fort Saskatchewan-Vegreville has the call.
Mr. Speaker, following yesterday's speech from the throne, the member for Edmonton South expressed his outrage at the notion that young Albertans might pursue careers in trades instead of following the outdated advice that the only acceptable option for youth is an academic degree? To the Minister of Advanced Education, could you enlighten the opposition and this House as to why this disregard for the trades is offensive to many young Albertans?
Order. The Honourable Minister of Advanced Education is the one with the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I couldn't agree more. The comments that the member made are completely reprehensible. And in fact, it's comments like those that cause people to denigrate the trades and look down on apprenticeship learning. That's the view that they have, Mr. Speaker, but I can be really clear. On this side of the House, we believe that a trade certificate has the same value, merit, and worth as a university degree, Mr. Speaker. And in fact, we need more young people to pursue apprenticeship learning, which is why we have developed a robust skills for jobs agenda to encourage more people to pursue apprenticeship learning. They don't believe that's a viable pathway, but we do, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Fort Saskatchewan-Vegreville.
Given, Mr. Speaker, that I myself am a journeyman tradesperson who knows the opportunities available in the trades, and given that too often young Albertans are not well informed of the kinds of economic opportunities that can be obtained through the pursuit of a trade certificate, can the Minister please tell the House about the kinds of opportunities available to those who want to pursue experiential learning and how these skills are in demand in the 21st century economy?
The Minister of Advanced Education.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Work-integrated learning and other experiential learning initiatives are incredibly important when we talk about post-secondary education in terms of helping set our students up and our graduates up for success once they've finished. There are a number of opportunities in many different curriculums within the post-secondary world, as well as other initiatives, primarily those of Women Building Futures and Careers Next Generation. And with respect to Women Building Futures, it's an incredible organization that helps to encourage more women to enter the skilled trades, just like Cecilia Buckmeyer, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member.
Given, Mr. Speaker, that we need more tradespeople to build and grow our economy, and given that the opposition seems to not be fully informed on this issue, and given that the members opposite claim to support tradespeople but did nothing to support them, can the Minister please tell the House what our government is doing to make the trades more accessible and encourage young Albertans to pursue the valuable careers that they offer?
Difficult to hear the question that time. I know it's surprising. The Honourable Member for Minister of Advanced Education.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. Indeed, our government has implemented a number of initiatives to encourage more individuals and young Albertans to pursue apprenticeship learning. We're working with, we've invested over $10 million to Careers Next Generation to quadruple the number of students that participate in the Registered Apprenticeship Program. We've provided $10 million as well to Women Building Futures to help encourage more women to enter industries and professions in which they are underrepresented. Mr. Speaker, again, we believe in the value and importance of apprenticeship learning and will help ensure our students have those pathways.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Glenora.
much, Mr. Speaker. Today I have a simple question for the Minister of Education. We seem to be having a hard time getting facts out of this minister in this House or in press conferences, but it's a new year, so let's try turning a new page in this place and start with some transparency and honesty. Yes or no, if you please, does the Minister of Education acknowledge that in the current fiscal year, under her leadership, schools saw a net reduction in their funding of $136 million?
Easy. The Honourable Minister of Education is rising.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the question. I can absolutely acknowledge that our government has maintained record spending in education. We are committed to providing a world-class, high-quality education for our children that starts with more money being directed to the classroom. Thank you.
Member for Edmonton Glenora.
Given that words and numbers used to mean something in this place, Mr. Speaker, and given that the cuts to education funding are why Edmonton Public Schools has cut 5 days of instruction from their calendar, and given that this puts more stress on parents trying to find childcare and driving up costs for their families, and given that this means our students here in Edmonton will have less days in the classroom, to the Minister, will you finally admit that your cuts are harming the education that our students deserve and creating tons of grief for their parents?
Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the question. Under this new model that we have brought forward, I can absolutely assure everyone that Alberta will continue to have one of the best funded education systems in the country. And I can quote Mary Martin from Calgary Catholic School District, who said, and I quote, "The reduction of red tape afforded by the new model will help reduce the complexity and workload involved in providing extensive and repetitious data, which in turn will allow our teachers to focus on what is most important, our students."
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Member.
Given that the Premier said we could trust him with education, and given that the Minister of Finance said new students would get new funding, Alberta parents thought that meant that the 15,000 more kids would mean more funding. But given that there was no new funding, there was actually a $136 million cut, as documents released by the minister's own department in black and white prove. Why won't the minister set the record straight? Did she ignore her Premier and decide to cut the funding unilaterally, or did her Premier direct her to do it?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the question. I categorically disagree with that statement, and I can absolutely assure parents that under this new model, we will be providing education, a world-class, high-quality education. And I want to quote John Lairs from Grand Prairie Public School Division, who says, "The increased flexibility afforded by this new funding model will help us to better allocate resources to address the unique needs of our students." We're meeting the needs of every single student in this province. I'm happy to say our new model is going to be well received by everyone.
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Order. The Honourable Member for Calgary Buffalo.
This government gave a $4.7 billion handout to profitable corporations and is forcing families across Alberta to pay for it. We're all paying more in income taxes thanks to this government. But the minister is also forcing municipalities to do his dirty work by compelling them to raise property taxes to maintain their existing services. These tax hikes are the most painful in rural areas. Why is this minister taking money away from rural families to pay for his no jobs corporate handout?
The Honourable the Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. We have provided the highest level of funding compared to comparable jurisdictions in this country to our municipal partners. This isn't a tax increase, Mr. Speaker. This is about ensuring tax dollars already being paid are going to the right places. We think Alberta's precious dollars should be allocated to core priorities. And the NDP spent the entire 4 years increasing taxes and making life unbearable for everyone. Mr. Speaker, we've taken a different approach to make sure that we are living within our means.
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Buffalo.
Thank you. Given that this minister has cut MSI funding that towns and counties rely on to maintain their infrastructure, and given the minister has announced the province isn't even going to pay all of its own municipal tax bills, and given this adds more than $1,000 to the tax notices of rural families, I'll ask the minister again, why is he pulling money out of the household budgets in rural Alberta to line the pockets of profitable corporations?
Hey, hey.
The Honourable, the Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the McKinnon report was clear. In case the members opposite have forgotten, municipalities in this province are being funded 20% higher than municipalities in provinces in this country. Mr. Speaker, we have brought in responsible restraint measures to bring this critical overspending closer in line with our fellow jurisdictions in this country. This includes, Mr. Speaker, our ability to sustain the MSI program across the board.
Here, here.
Honourable member for Calgary-Buffalo.
Thank you. Given that these new additional taxes don't include cuts to speeding tax revenue, cuts to the Alberta Community Transit Fund, cuts to the Municipal Water Wastewater Program or the Community Resilience Program, and given that they don't include the huge new municipal costs associated with the new rural policing model, you know, the one that the government hasn't invested a single cent in yet, can the minister tell rural Albertans just how high their property taxes will go in order to pay for his $4.7 billion no jobs corporate handout?
Hey, hey.
The Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, many of our municipal partners are doing great work to deliver services while keeping taxes low. Mr. Speaker, we know that they can get the job done. The NDP again left a physical disaster for us to clean up. We are implementing a responsible restraint to clean up the NDP's mess, and our municipal partners support this approach.
The Honourable Member for Fort McMurray-Lac-La-Biche.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In recent weeks, Albertans and Canadians from coast to coast have been inundated with news of illegal barricades and protests disrupting railways and highways across our country. These barricades have been set up in response to RCMP action protecting the Coastal GasLink pipeline in British Columbia. These irresponsible actions have caused rail companies to lay off hundreds of employees and have delayed or jeopardized passenger travel across our country. Could the Minister of Justice and Solicitor General please advise what stance our government has taken on these blockades?
The Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, this government respects the rule of law. And we expect our law enforcement personnel, Mr. Speaker, to enforce the laws across this Canada. That's why we're calling on justice ministers from coast to coast to follow Alberta's lead, to make sure we crack down. Not now, not ever will we fall prey to these people that want to hold our economy hostage, Mr. Speaker. People on the other side of the aisle, they're heckling, Mr. Speaker. They're endorsing Extinction Rebellion to go into our schools, Mr. Speaker. We say no. We say not now, not ever, not in Alberta.
Member for Fort McMurray-Lac-La-Biche.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Minister. The federal government remained silent for far too long on the disruption of peace and, frankly, this act of violence against our economy. Given that the Liberal cabinet had been considering refusing the approval of Teck Frontier oil sands mine despite thorough consultations with stakeholders and affected Indigenous communities over the past 5 years, and given that earlier this week we found out that Teck Resources has withdrawn their application, alluding to public safety concerns, could the Minister of Justice please explain possible repercussions of the federal government's delayed response to the attack on our resource sector?
The Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, we're seeing a breakdown in confidence in the justice system across this entire country, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the other side right now, they're heckling, Mr. Speaker. They're endorsing Extinction Rebellion on the other side, Mr. Speaker. This side of the aisle, we respect the rule of law. That's why we're bringing in new measures, Mr. Speaker, to crack down on these illegal blockades, Mr. Speaker. This side of the aisle, Mr. Speaker, we're calling on justice ministers from coast to follow Alberta's lead. Do not enable these people, Mr. Speaker. Crack down on this, enforce the rule of law across Canada.
A point of order is noted at approximately 2:18. I might just provide some caution to the members of the official opposition with what words they might choose to heckle with. The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for the response. Given that Teck has withdrawn their application, which had it been approved would have provided the opportunity for 7,000
100,000 jobs in Alberta, and given that the future of the Coastal GasLink project still faces uncertainty, and given that the attack on our energy sector seems to be increasing despite First Nations approving these projects, as was the case with Teck, could the Minister of Energy please tell us what the government is doing to combat these disrespectful and frankly dishonest attacks on our clean, ethical, natural resource sector?
Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Teck withdrawal is part of a pattern of over $100 billion of projects cancelled or vetoed by the Trudeau government in the past 4 years. What the Teck withdrawal highlights is the need for the federal government to have a climate plan that reconciles the need to develop our natural resources. And that's what's been missing. And Ottawa won't recognize that the provinces, that Alberta has a constitutional right under Section 92A to develop our resources. That's why our government is doing everything we can to defend our constitutional rights. The NDP didn't, they wouldn't, they abandoned our constitutional authorities to Justin Trudeau, and we won't do that.
The honourable member for Edmonton South has a question.
Mr. Speaker, this Premier promised to create jobs. He promised to be, quote, laser focused on jobs. However, all we've seen is investment in Wisconsin and Newfoundland, while hard-working Albertans are left picking up the bill for his failed $4.7 billion corporate handout. Yesterday's throne speech promises to cut nearly $200 million from the capital plan, which will cost us potentially thousands of construction jobs. Will the Minister of Infrastructure explain to construction workers and tradespeople why he wants to put them out of work?
The Minister of Infrastructure is rising.
Mr. Speaker, if you remember on our campaign commitment platform, we committed to honor the existing capital plan, which was $24.2 billion in 4 years. And that's our commitment, and we are keeping that commitment. Construction workers in Alberta knows that fully well. They were put out of work by that government when they were in government, Mr. Speaker, NDP. So we are creating jobs in construction industry. Even today, we announced a major project for Central Alberta, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Edmonton South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, given that this minister just reiterated his commitment to the capital plan that our NDP government proposed, but given that in yesterday's throne speech, the only concrete promise this government made was to reduce that capital plan by $200 million, and given that our government prioritized building our province after decades of conservative neglect and created good jobs in this province, to the same minister, why did you favor paying off billionaire CEOs over the paychecks of our hardworking construction industry?
The Honourable Minister of Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, I would encourage the member opposite to wait for the budget tomorrow, and then once he sees that announcement in tomorrow's budget, he'll be deflated. So stay tuned for now.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, given that these cuts have already been shown in the throne speech, and given that this government only seems to care about propping up the balance sheets of big corporations, to the minister, will you let the House know what projects will be cancelled or delayed because of this broken promise on the capital plan? And can you tell this House exactly how many jobs will be lost due to this $200 million cut?
The Honourable, the Minister of Finance and the President of the Treasury Board.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would agree with the member on our side that stay tuned for the budget tomorrow, and perhaps we'll see the member deflated tomorrow as a result of his allegations. Mr. Speaker, we will be rolling out some key capital projects that will improve our productivity in this province, improve our competitiveness, attract investment, create long-term jobs for Albertans. Mr. Speaker, we're looking forward to rolling out the budget tomorrow.
Order. The honourable member from Calgary McCall would like to ask a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've heard from many concerned constituents in Alberta about the rising electricity prices. Yesterday, it surfaced that electricity rates in Calgary have shot up 19%. Wow. 19% above the cap that we had in place. This is shameful. So, Minister, can you commit today to Calgarian and Albertan paying more for electricity all over the province that you will reinstate the price cap so they don't get left out in the cold?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker. By ending the price cap, the rate price cap program, Albertan taxpayers have been saved millions of dollars and have maintained consumer choice. In the 2 years since it was implemented, this has cost Alberta taxpayers. Those are the same taxpayers that pay for electricity. It has cost them $90 million. And had it continued until April of 2021, it's expected it would have cost Alberta taxpayers, the same people who pay electricity bills, it would have cost them an additional $283 million. Mr. Speaker, we have restored the energy-only market, which will solve some of the electricity problems.
The honourable member for Calgary-McCall.
Given that during debate for Bill 18, the government voted against an amendment to ban economic withholding, thus protecting consumers from potential price fixing, and given that actions such as economic withholding potentially lead to price spikes for consumers, will the minister commit to establish a strong consumer protection framework banning economic withholding and protecting consumers from unfair price spikes like the one Albertans are seeing now?
The Honourable, the Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker, the previous government implemented the regulated rate cap to disguise and protect electricity consumers for rising electricity costs that would have cost from their policies. Mr. Speaker, they phased out the coal-fired generators at a cost of $1.4 billion. That costs taxpayers. Their debacle with the return of the PPA contracts costs taxpayers $2.7 billion. So, Mr. Speaker, all of those things were being added onto electricity bills, and many of their policies were to hide their incompetencies.
The honourable member.
Given that Calgarians are only just learning of the added costs to heat their homes, and heat their homes in Alberta, I might add, to the minister, can you at least commit to Calgarians, whom you also claim to represent, that they will not see another price spike of 19%, or you don't just care?
The honourable minister.
Mr. Speaker, the consumers in Calgary and elsewhere and across the entire province can choose to sign into a contract with over 30 rate providers that will set a firm electricity rate that is below the 6.8% rate cap that the NDP had initiated. Mr. Speaker, that option is available for all Albertans. We also have the utility consumer advocate that is there to help Albertans and to direct them into various sources. Mr. Speaker, there is no reason that Albertans have to pay more than 6.8 cents. There's rate options and regulated contracts.
The honourable member for Calgary South East.
You found me. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As you know, we are in a period of fiscal restraint. On Thursday, February the 20th, a new physician funding framework was announced. It was announced that Alberta will maintain physician funding at $5.4 billion, the highest level ever, and implement its final offer to the Alberta Medical Association, or AMA, to avoid a forecasted $2 billion in cost overruns. Can the Minister of Health walk us through key events that led to this decision and the timeline of negotiations, consultations, and mediation?
The Honourable, the Minister of Health has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I can advise the House that in September of last year, we advised the Alberta Medical Association that we wish to begin negotiations with them. Those negotiations began in November. We gave them a few months to be able to prepare. At the same time, we began consultations on 11 proposed changes to the schedule of medical benefits. And in January, when no agreement was reached, Mr. Speaker, we then agreed to voluntary mediation. And we actually also agreed to those 11 consultation proposals to also be included in the mediations. But despite repeated efforts throughout that month, Mr. Speaker, we were unable to.
The honourable member for Calgary South East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Minister. The 11 consultation proposals put forward by the government will also be implemented on March 31st of 2020. This includes phasing in changes to complex modifiers, reducing the rate physicians can charge for this billing code to $9 from $18 for a period of 1 year before the code is removed in 2021-2022. Can the Minister of Health explain complex modifiers, how they compare to other jurisdictions, how they are being used here in Alberta, and why this change is being made?
The Honourable, the Minister of Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, complex modifiers are intended to pay physicians who are paid On a fee-for-service basis, extra for a longer visit. The first modifier was intended to pay for a patient visit going from minute 15 to minute 25, as opposed to a typical 15-minute visit. And however, most physicians were billing that at minute 15. So it became a 50% increase in the cost of a 15-minute visit. And it means that instead we're commonly paying $62 for a basic office visit. And this was absolutely not the intention of the complex modifier at the 50-minute mark, Mr. Speaker. So we're reducing that first modifier by half for this fiscal year.
The honourable member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you again, Minister. In the summer of 2020, at the direction of the Minister of Health, the Government of Alberta will introduce a new Alternative Relationship Plan, or ARP, with built-in transition benefits to encourage physicians to move from fee-for-service to 3-year contracts. For the benefit of everyone here and my constituents, can the Minister of Health please explain ARPs and the perceived advantages over a fee-for-service arrangement?
The honourable minister.
Well, as we know, Mr. Speaker, fee-for-service isn't right for every physician in every practice. The alternative relationship plans enable a physician to spend more time with patients and to address complex needs without worrying about their compensation being tied to delivering specific services. The Canadian average for physicians on those ARPs is 34%. Alberta is the lowest among primary care physicians on an ARP. We're at just 5%. So Alberta Health is streamlining the process for joining an ARP, and once we receive an acceptable application, we're implementing those within 6 weeks, Mr. Speaker. And I encourage all physicians to be able to proceed with this.
The honourable member for St. Albert is rising with a question.
On January the 21st, the Minister of Community and Social Services emailed me a 2020 calendar for Asian income support payments, and it was consistent with previous years, with payments several days before the end of the month. But only 7 days later, the Minister suddenly released a new calendar, which delayed payments to the first day of the following month. To the Minister, what happened in those 7 days to make you change the payment calendar?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, the payment date was changed to ensure that the benefit was aligned with the cost that the payment actually incurred in the same month. Thank you.
For St. Albert.
You won't be on the front bench long.
Given that these changes mean that disabled and low-income Albertans are now at risk of being penalized for late rent and not having a bus pass on the first of the month, and given that this minister's press secretary accidentally sent an email to reporters that revealed there had been no consultation with the community before the changes were made to the minister, isn't it true that this last-minute change to the schedule was driven by instructions from the finance minister to find in-year savings?
Absolutely.
The Honourable the Minister of Community and Social Services.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. What I can tell you is that every year in January we see an uptick in emergency support services because folks do run out of money. At that time, there was a 41-day period between checks during that time. So this change was made to ensure consistency, predictability, and to make sure that that day between payments was reduced.
Hear, hear.
For St. Albert's, the one with the call.
Yeah, people knock down my door, say, don't pay me before Christmas, wait till after. Yeah. Given that the payment date for seniors' benefit did not change, and given I'm sure the minister has been inundated with letters and phone calls about this huge change, trust me, they speak to me too. Yeah. To the minister, will you right here and now reverse your thoughtless and cruel decision to change Asian income support payment dates? It's time to do the right thing. You didn't do it for seniors. Give these guys a break. They should have been paid Monday. Why do they have to wait till Friday?
The Honourable the Minister of Community and Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, no changes will be made. The new dates are going to stand as they are. And what I would like to say to all folks who are impacted by these date changes is please do contact your caseworker or the Alberta Supports offices. I'm certainly committed to helping them transition through this change, but there will be no changes to the dates.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Knowles.
Thank
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 8,000 Albertans and counting have signed a petition telling this government to take their hands off their pensions. Every time they sign this petition, the Minister of Finance gets an email. Albertans can sign this petition at yourpensionisyours.ca. To the Minister of Finance, can you explain to all the Albertans who are flooding your inbox why you're meddling with their hard-earned money and their retirement?
You're here.
The Honourable, the Minister of Finance and the President of Treasury Board.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member opposite for the question because I can answer that question very simply. We're not meddling with their pensions.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Millwoods.
People disagree.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that Albertans have also joined us for Facebook Live conversations about this government's terrible decisions, and given that pensions, and specifically teachers and their pensions have been particularly vocal, on one of those Facebook Lives, Stephen from Red Deer wanted us to ask the minister, will he cover any shortfall if the investment returns from AIMCO are not as high as they were under the very successful Alberta Teachers Retirement Fund? And so to the minister, please answer, Stephen, will you cover any shortfalls?
The Honourable, the Minister of Finance and the President of Treasury Board.
Well, Mr. Speaker, to answer the question from Stephen, the reality was back in the pre-1992 teacher pensions, Alberta taxpayers covered those shortfalls. We as a government have a responsibility to all Albertans to ensure that pensions are in the strongest financial position possible, Mr. Speaker. That is why the investment management portion and function was moved to AIMCO so that these pensions could be managed at a lower cost to the benefit of teachers and Alberta taxpayers.
Exactly. Well done.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Millwoods.
Given, Mr. Speaker, that Albertans are listening to this and Albertans are aware of the facts of this case having been shared for months now, Pam also tuned into a recent Facebook conversation and she had a question for the minister that I will ask on behalf of her and the other concerned Albertans. To the minister, how is it legal to enact what Pam described as a, quote, essential hostile takeover of the teachers' pension fund? How is this the government's money to take? Will you apologize for your shocking lack of consultation? Will you undo Bill 22 and restart this process with proper engagement? And have you learned how to govern like adults yet?
I might just caution the member that she can't do indirectly what she can do directly, even when using a quote. The Honourable Member or Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, this government has not taken over teachers' pensions. Mr. Speaker, we have simply mandated that the investment function of teachers' pensions is moved to AIMCO. Mr. Speaker, ATRF will continue to be the trustee of teachers' pensions. ATRF will continue to provide high-level strategic direction of teachers' pensions. Mr. Speaker, this move to move the management function to AIMCO simply strengthens teachers' pensions and provides better return to Alberta taxpayers.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Cross.
Mr. Speaker, Canada is a vast country and rail plays a crucial role in transporting heavy goods and passengers across thousands of kilometres. With the recent blockades, however, Canadians are feeling the consequences. Thousands of workers were laid off of CN Rail and Via Rail as a direct result of the blockages. Ships are backlogged in our ports and businesses are threatening to move elsewhere. The protesters, Mr. Speaker, are holding our country hostage. Minister, hardworking Albertans are suffering. What immediate steps is this government doing to mitigate the situation and restore confidence?
The Honourable, the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, when blockades went up in Alberta, moments after that, Mr. Speaker, that very morning, our government came out with a clear statement, not in Alberta. We will not tolerate this behaviour in this province, Mr. Speaker. Within 12 hours, those blockades are down in Alberta. Mr. Speaker, around the country, we're asking them to follow Alberta's lead, take a decisive step beyond the side of the law, Mr. Speaker, beyond the side of making sure that the law is enforced in this province and across our country, Mr. Speaker. We're calling on justice ministers coast to coast, follow our lead. Take a look at Bill 1, Mr. Speaker. It's an amazing bill. We expect to see it passed in this House.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Minister. Given that industries from coast to coast are feeling the burden of these blockades, and given that eastern provinces are running out of petroleum, exporters' goods are going to waste, Rail companies are ceasing operation and millions, potentially billions of economic losses are at stake. And given that thousands of Canadians, many of whom are here in our great province, are facing the threat of layoffs, can the minister tell this House what actions need to be immediately taken to protect the livelihood of thousands of Canadians, and many of those right here at home?
The Honourable the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, we need to have a conversation about the future of justice across this country. Our current system is designed for decades ago, Mr. Speaker. Right now, we have situations where people are doing TikTok with social media stuff on our rail lines, Mr. Speaker. We got Extinction Rebellion advocating for the shutdown of blockades, Mr. Speaker. We have the members opposite who won't even condemn Extinction Rebellion, Mr. Speaker. They show up at their protests, Mr. Speaker. We respect the rule of law on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker. We're bringing forward bills, Mr. Speaker. The members opposite are laughing at the rule of law. They don't respect it, Mr. Speaker. This side of the House does.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Glenora will come to order. The Honourable Member for Calgary Cross.
Speaker, Dennis Darby, CEO of Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters, said, quote, "If the blockades extend into that 2-week range, most companies will have to start temporary layoffs and cutting shifts because we don't have inventory." Given that the Trudeau government has refused to take concrete action and has instead pandered to the illegal protesters, and given that Canada's reputation as a safe and reliable country is being threatened by the actions of these rogue actors, to the Minister, we know about Bill 1. What other steps are being taken to prevent these types of incidents from reoccurring?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. More damage to Canada's reputation as a place to invest has been done over the last few weeks than I would say than even Bill C-69, Mr. Speaker. This is catastrophic. We need the rule of law in this country. Are we going to be a country of anarchy, Mr. Speaker? Or are we going to be a country of the rule of law? We're calling on the federal government to enforce the law, Mr. Speaker. We're calling on justice ministers from across this country. Take a look at the legislation we're bringing forward in this province. Take a look at the leadership in this province, Mr. Speaker. We expect the law to be enforced, Mr. Speaker. We hope that the rest of the country will follow Alberta's lead.
Honourable members, in 30 seconds or less, we will proceed to member statements. The Honourable Member for Central Peace Notley.
I stand with those who believe Canada is in crisis caused by years of complacency and inaction by our governments, our people, and our corporations. Years of legal attacks have turned to brazen illegal attacks. Foreign interference, meddling, and manipulation brought about by misguided crusaders and self-serving financial opportunists attack Canada because of our gentle and polite democracy allows them the opportunity to exploit us in our own country. Tech resources withdrawal after years